We're on today. We're on Daf Kafchet. We're going to start at the very bottom of Kaf Zayin Amud Bet, where we left off yesterday, right after the Mishnah. Because we had said, where did we get the idea that pishtan, that flax or linen is considered a tree, because of the pasuk about Rahav, that she covered the spies that Yoshua sent with what was called pishtei etz, describing pishtan as a type of tree. So then we said, so what this means is that if you have an ohel, if you have, let's say, a tent, and underneath the tent is a dead body or even human remains, so anything that's under the tent, of course, becomes tameh. That's called tumat. That's one kind of tumat ohel. But the other kind of tumat ohel is that the ohel itself, the covering itself, becomes tameh as well. That's why it says in the parsha of Para Aduma that you have to purify not just whatever was inside the tent, but the tent itself. However, it does depend on what the tent was made of. So the only thing, for example, if the roof over you was made of wood, so you would become tameh because you're under the same roof as the dead body, but the wood would not become tameh. The only exception is pishtan. If the tent is made of linen, you have a linen tent over your head, so even the tent itself will become tameh from having been a tent over human remains, and as a result of that, it will also have to be purified. That's what the Mishnah is saying. So minalan.
Is that only flax or is it any cloth?
Usually it would be any cloth, but in terms of tree-derived, we're talking about tree-based substances. So of tree-based substances, the only thing that's subject to tum'ah in this way is going to be flax, which is considered a tree. So minalan, where do we get this idea from? Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Gamar oil mi mishkan. As we turn to Amud Aleph of Daf Kafchet, that we learn from the connection of the words ohel in connection with the Mishkan. Ketiv V'cha, it says here with regard to the impurity that is conveyed to a tent. Zot Torah Adam, Zot Torah Adam ki yamut be'ohel. That this is the Torah. This is the instruction. A person who dies in the tent, and then it says everybody in the tent, etc., is going to be tameh. Uchtiv hatav vayifros et ha'ohel ala mishkan. And it says with regard to the Mishkan that they spread out the tent over the Mishkan. What does that mean? What it means, actually there were 3 or possibly 4 layers of covering of the Mishkan. You remember the Mishkan that we always see the pictures of. So the first covering was there was one level of covering, and then a second level of covering, then a third level of covering, and then possibly a fourth, as we're going to see as a machloket later. So when it says that they spread the ohel over the Mishkan, they spread the covering over the Mishkan. So we see that ohel, the layer that's being discussed there, is actually made, at least partially, of linen. It's actually made of wool and linen. But therefore we can derive, because it says ohel over there, it says that the ohel is spread out, and that ohel is referring to the covering of linen. So we see that when it says ohel with regard to impurity of a dead body, it also means a linen covering or a linen tent. So malahalan shel pishtan karui ohel, just like over there, what is made from linen is called ohel. It's called tent. Afkan shel pishtan karui ohel. So too with regard to the impurity issues, we will call whatever is made of linen is also subject to the rules of tent. But if you're going to make an analogy, you're going to make an equation between the covering of the Mishkan and the tent with respect to impurity, then you're going to have to go a step further, because the covering of the Mishkan didn't just have regular linen. It had linen that was actually what's called shizurim. What they did was they took 6 threads of linen. Every thread was actually made of 6 threads of linen that were wound together. They were like cables. They were like cables, right? So they're made of 6 threads each. These are very thick threads. Maybe only a tent made of such thick threads should be subject to tum'ah. If we're going to make an analogy from the Mishkan, we should go all the way and make it a complete analogy. So Talmud Lamar, that's why the Torah says ohel riba. That's why it says the word ohel several times in the context, in the parasha of Tumat Met, in the parasha that discusses the impurity of the dead. It mentions the word ohel several times to be a more expansive category. So even though we base the fact that the material of flax or the material of linen is subject to tum'ah from the case of the Mishkan. We don't have to go to the level of specificity of the Mishkan, and we could say that even a single threaded flax, single threaded linen is going to be enough to be subject to tum'ah. We don't have to have it. It doesn't have to be a situation that is exactly the same as the Mishkan.
Or under a tree.
You will become tameh, but the tree won't become tameh. We're talking about the ohel itself becoming tameh. Yeah, if you stand under a tree, but the tree doesn't get affected. So that's why, like for example, if a kohen walks under a tree, the famous case, they have these cemeteries where the trees are hanging over the cemetery and they're hanging over the highway. You have cases like that. So they can't, the kohen is not allowed to walk under that tree or to drive. Right, it's a big problem. So the tree doesn't become tameh though, only the person. Yeah. So then the Gemara asks, ohel riba, if you're going to say that the fact that it mentions the word ohel so many times in the context of tumat met means that we should expand the category of filu kol milei nami. So then why don't we just say that it includes everything? Why do you limit it at all? So the Gemara answers, imken gzera shava mai hanele, because then the equation between the case of impurity of the dead and the case of the Mishkan will be insignificant. It won't teach us anything. In other words, it has to be there to teach us something. So it's teaching us that linen is also considered an ohel for this purpose. It's also considered a tent. It's subject to tumat ohel, but it doesn't go so far as to connect them in every respect. That therefore it has to be 6 threads woven together or twisted together. Ve'ema malehalan kirashim afkan kirashim. Maybe you will say that just like over there. Kerashim, we're dealing with boards. The Mishkan has boards, right? The boards that hold up the structure. So too, maybe wood should be an ohel. In other words, if you have a wooden roof over you and there's a human remains under the same roof with you, the boards on the roof should also become tameh. How do you know that since Kerashim are also part of the Mishkan, and it mentions Kerashim, it mentions the boards in connection with the Mishkan? So the answer is because Amar Kra ve'asita Kerashim lam Mishkan. It says you should make boards for the Mishkan. For the Mishkan means Mishkan karoi Mishkan, that the covering over the top is what's called the Mishkan. Ve'en Kerashim karoi Mishkan, but what's holding them up is not called the Mishkan. Mishkan, the word Mishkan or the word ohel, the word tent is only referring to the top covering, and the top covering of the Mishkan was not wooden; it was only fabric.
But then you can make the same argument for everything that comprises the Mishkan, like the walls and the.
Well, that's why it's saying that it's not. In other words, it seems that the thought of the Gemara was that since the boards specifically hold up the covering, so they're part of the same thing. They're all part of one unit.
So what is the Mishkan?
Just the fabric covering over the roof. So that's what's being called Mishkan here. Yeah, that's what's being called Mishkan. So that's why it says Lam Mishkan, just like in the Sukkot, it's the Schach, right? So that's why it says Lam Mishkan. It's for the Mishkan, but it isn't the Mishkan, because the essence of the Mishkan is that covering. But there are 3 different parts of the Mishkan. There's an open outer area called the Chatzer, which doesn't have a roof. And then inside is the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim, which have a covering. They have a roof over them. And so all of these fabric coverings that we're talking about over the top are only over what's called the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. What's inside? The Kodesh has the menorah, the Mizbeach for Ketoret only, and the Shulchan that had the bread on it. And of course the Kodesh HaKodeshim, we know what's in there. The area with the Mizbeach for Korbanot didn't have a roof over it. The smoke went up. Didn't have a roof over. So and also in the Beit HaMikdash, it didn't have a roof over that part either. That was also outdoors. That part of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so if that's the case, if that's the case, it also says make a covering for the ohel. So it says it's not that the covering is not the ohel. The covering is for the ohel. And if that's the case, then that covering, which in that particular context is talking about, because remember, there's several different levels of covering. What is the michsel ohel? What is the covering of the tent? Is actually animal skin, because you have these levels of cloth, and then you have animal skin over that. So the animal skin over that is orot elim me'odamim that it always talks about. So that animal skin shouldn't be subject to tumah either, because it says it's a mechset la ohel. It's a covering for the ohel, meaning it's not the ohel itself. It's not the tent itself, but it's a covering for the tent. So how do you explain that? So So the Gemara says no, because so hachinami mechsel lo ikre hachinami. So too here. Michsel lo ikre ohel. So you might think that the covering is not ohel. Ella had ba'er Rabbi Elazar or be'emat me'ah Moshe yitameh ba'ohel hamet. But we have a problem. We can't conclude that. In other words, the way the Gemara is going to work this out is by showing that it's you can't conclude this way. So yes, you have a good point. It says michsel ohel, that we have this layer of these two layers of fabric, two layers of fabric from animals. And then you have on top the layer of animal skins. Okay, now you want to say that layer of animal skins shouldn't be called ohel because it says michsela ohel. It's a covering for the tent. It isn't the tent itself. But if that's the case, you're going to have another problem, which is that Rabbi Elazar asked a question about this. And he asked, whether a non-kosher animal skin that is serving as a tent over you with human remains under it, whether that covering will become tameh. Now again, we're not talking about what's under the covering. What's under the covering, it doesn't matter what the covering is, what the awning is made of. What matters is, will the awning itself, so to speak, will the covering itself become tameh? So, when that covering is of a non-kosher animal, Rabbi Elazar asked, is it subject to tum'ah when it's serving as a roof over you? So, the problem is, how can he ask that question? How can Rabbi Elazar ask that question? Because if the kosher covering of the Mishkan, which was the orot elim me'odamim, elim are kosher animals, ram skins, they're from a kosher animal. If that doesn't become tameh, you're telling me, because that isn't called ohel, right? That's called the covering of the ohel. So why is Rabbi Elazar even asking about non-kosher animal skins? You should ask about kosher animal skins. The kosher animal skins are clearly not considered ohel either. So his question wouldn't make any sense. Rather, we must conclude that Rabbi Elazar is presuming that the skin covering is also subject to tum'ah. That's why he's asking, what about non-kosher skin covering? So the answer is that true, in general, if we had something that said the krashim, for example, the boards are for the Mishkan, that means they're for the Mishkan, they aren't the Mishkan itself. If it said a covering for the tent, la oil, generally that would mean it isn't the tent, it's a covering for the tent. But here, the pasuk goes back and includes everything. Dichtiv, as it says later, they carried the curtains of the Mishkan and the tent of meeting it's covering, and the covering of the tachash, which is on top of it, we're going to talk about the tachash in a second, that makish elyon letachton matachton karoi oil af elyon karoi oil. So in the end, it brings all of these items and puts them in one category. Calls it the covering, and together with the yiriot, together with the curtains. So we see that the covering is considered a covering, is equated to rather the ohel covering. So they're all included in one category in one pasuk.
Does the carry the boards too?
They carried the boards too, but it doesn't mention it there. But it doesn't mention it in that pasuk. Right? In that pasuk, it's only talking about the fabrics and the coverings. So from the fact that it includes the fabrics and the coverings in one category, so therefore they come back and say they're all considered as one entity. That's how the Gemara resolves the problem, and therefore a kosher skin tent would certainly be mikabel tumah. The only question is going to be, as we're going to see, whether a non-kosher one will be. So the Gemara goes back. Gufa, let's go back by Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar asks, or if you have a tent over you that's made of non-kosher animal skin, will the tent become tameh? Tumat. Not whether you will. You will definitely. Will the tent become? So why is he asking the question? Amar Ravada Barahava said, Tachash. He's asking about the tachash. We know that there was an extra covering called the or tachash, the skin of the tachash. Nobody knows exactly what the tachash is. It's some kind of animal that had multicolored skin. So that's what he's asking. So, tameh haya or tahor haya? Was it a tameh animal or a tahor animal? In other words, was it a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal? If it was a kosher animal, the tachash, so then you can't prove anything about non-kosher animal skins. We wouldn't have any precedent for a non-kosher animal skin tent being mikabel tumah, because all we have is a tachash. That's later. No, that's something else. That's something else. So that would be, if it's tahor, if it's kosher animal, we don't have any precedent for non-kosher. But if the tachash is a non-kosher animal, and we know it's part of the covering of the Mishkan, then it would prove that even a non-kosher animal skin is called ohel and would therefore be subject to impurity if it's serving as a tent over human remains. Amar Rav Yosef said, why are you asking the question? Tanina, we already learned that the only thing that was ever allowed for use in Masekhet Shamayim means in any divine work, in any holy work, was only kosher animals. We never allow a non-kosher animal. So the tachash had to be kosher. So how can you even ask a question? So Mativ, Rabbi Abba raised an objection to this. Rabbi Yehuda says, and he's quoting here a braita to raise his objection. Rabbi Yehuda said, "Shnei mechsaot hayu, echad shel orot elei me'odamim, echad shel orot techashim." Rabbi Nechemyahu omer mechsa echad hayav domeh kemin tila ilan. So he says that there's a machloket here. When it always says there's an orot elei me'odamim ve'orot techashim milmala, right? So it always says that it always talks about them together, but it's not clear. Was the orot elim me'odamim, was the covering of the ram skins and the covering of the tachash skin one layer that was combined together? That's what Rabbi Nechemia says. He says it was kind of like a tela ilan, which is some kind of a creature that has multicolored skins. I don't know if it's what it's trying to show a picture there, but I'm not sure what that is.
Some type of.
It looks like some kind of an animal that has a blended. The skin looks like of different colors. So either it's talking about one covering. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. It was two coverings. It was that there was the covering of the red ram skins, and on top of that was the covering of the or tachash, of the skin of the tachash. But Rabbi Nechemia says no, it was all one. It was all united into one entity. So so we're going to see what the point is here. But the telailan is a tamei animal, and you're saying that covering was like a telailan. So aren't you saying that covering was of a non-kosher animal? So the Gemara answers, all we said was that it was like the skin of the telailan, whatever that creature is, because it has different colors. But it isn't a telailan, because here both animals involved are tahor. In other words, that the tachash is a kosher animal. Okay, that's what he's saying. It's a kosher animal. So even though the combination of skins might look like a non-kosher animal skin, and we were saying, that kind of looks like a non-kosher animal skin, but we're not saying it's non-kosher. We're saying that tachash is kosher because the only thing that would ever be used in the Mishkan is going to be from a kosher animal.
And there are no other non-kosher animal skins in the
Mishkan. Nope. So Rav Yosef said, this explains why we call it a sasgona, why we call the tachash a sasgona, as Rashi says, that it had many colors. Sasgona literally means shesas bigvanim harbe, that it celebrates, it's so happy with its multicolored skin. In other words, that the tachash was a multicolored skin animal, and so it's similar to this telailan in that it has multicolored skin, but it's a kosher animal, and therefore, there we go. So that's what it looks like. Okay,
that's a telah.
It's a type of cat.
But that's a kosher animal.
It's called a genet.
That's the point. They said it's not a kosher animal. That animal. It's saying but it has skin that looks like that. The tachash is kosher. Okay. So in whatever case may be. All right. So we're concluding that it's a kosher animal for now. Okay. We're provisionally concluding that. Rava says, or behemat me'asa. Now Rava says, you know what? You have a problem. What's your problem? You want to know whether non-kosher animal skin is that forms an ohel. Non-kosher animal skin that forms an ohel is going to become tamei met. Okay, susceptible to the tumat met. That's what you want to know, right? So that's the question that everybody wants to know, and we can't prove it from the Mishkan for a very simple reason, because the Mishkan, it's all kosher. So we only have a precedent for kosher. So we don't have any way to prove it. So Rava comes along and he says, I'm going to solve it anyway. I'm going to solve your problem. Forget about the tachash for a second. Forget about whether that's kosher or non-kosher. Even if we presume that it's kosher and therefore you have no precedent for a tent being made out of a non-kosher animal skin, we can still prove something about non-kosher animal skins. Let's do it. Rava says, Rava Amar, I'm going to prove it to you from the following case, and by the way, what Rava is going to do here is a 3-step process. He's going to derive it from source 1, derive it from source 2, and then say that neither one is sufficient, and say the combination of the sources is what resolves the question. So he says, so he says, where do we get it from? Titania is learned in a Braita. Or va'or. It says, when it talks about or, when it talks about skin, with regard to tumat negaim, with regard to tzarat, it says, o va'or. Or in skin. And we know that the word or oftentimes is an expanding word. When we interpret the biblical text and we're looking for hints of how to interpret it halachically, we use extra vavs and extra words o to expand categories. So o va'or is an expansive term. Riba or behemat me'ah. It includes the skin of a non-kosher animal, and v'shalakav yad kohen. What that means is like this: that if you had a non-kosher animal, so you had the skin of a horse, and you use this horse hide for various things, and it can get tzarat on it. If you see tzarat on there and you bring it to the kohen, you can declare it as tameh. Tameh of tzarat. Now, what happens if, because the skin of a non-kosher animal is not tameh, which should be obvious from this, right? By itself, it's not tameh. Only the meat is. So v'shalakav yad kohen. And if you bring a garment to the Kohen, now remember, there are certain specifications about what is considered tzara'at. We talk about that in Parashat Tazriah in a lot of detail in Parashat Mitzorah. So when you bring the garment to the Kohen, maybe what you saw when you first, now it always talks about the owner of the item seeing the tzara'at and then bringing it to the Kohen to declare it as good or not good. So what if what you saw was a minor discoloration, but you said, you know what, I'm going to go to the Kohen anyway. And when you hand it to him, he's looking at it, and lo and behold, while he's looking at it, it expands. It gets worse. So he doesn't make a decision based on what you saw. He's going to make a decision based on what he sees. Okay, that's not germane to our discussion. It's just another thing that's learned out of the pasuk here. So the main thing that we see here is that or behemat me'ah, that even if you have a horse hide or a pig's hide or whatever, and it has a discoloration of tzara'at on it, that is considered a valid tzara'at, even though the skin is not a kosher animal skin. So we see that in the category of tzara'at, katzatz mikulan v'asa'achat mehen minayin Talmud lamar o b'chov lechet or. So one last point is if you cut from multiple sources of skin and you made one entity out of them, that can also be subject to tumat tzara'at. In other words, because it says o b'chov melechet or, anything made out of skin. In other words, even if you combine various skins and you made one entity, it's also subject to tumat tzara'at. Again, that doesn't have anything to do with our immediate discussion here. These are just other points that are learned out from these pesukim regarding what kind of skin can be subject to the tzara'at, the so-called leprosy impurity. So that's what Rava wants to show. Rava showed that in the category of tzara'at, in the category of this leprosy impurity, we see that non-kosher animal skin that has a discoloration can be tameh. So we should apply the same and say that a non-kosher animal skin that's stretched as a tent over human remains will become tameh itself also. Should be. So no, they said ikal mifrach. It's not true. We can undermine this analogy because man lenegaim sheken shetiva erev tameh behen. Because when it comes to negaim, when it comes to tumat tzara'at, we know that it has a stringency that even just the strings that haven't been woven yet, the vertical and horizontal strings that you haven't woven them together yet, they're ready for use, but they haven't been woven, even that can get tzara'at if it has a discoloration. So if even that can get tzara'at, certainly any kind of tent, even a non-kosher animal skin, could get tzara'at. Maybe it's because tzara'at is so stringent that we apply its rules even to a non-kosher animal skin. But maybe it wouldn't be true about tumat met. Maybe about impurity of it, that it wouldn't be true. So then Rava comes back and says, gamar mishiratzim. Rather, we can learn it from shiratzim. Now shiratzim is just kind of a code word for all other kinds of impurity, because they're standard. Shiratzim literally means the creepy, crawly animals, the crawling animals that are the 8 animals that can, their bodies, their carcasses convey tum'ah according to the Torah. We actually learn about that later in Masekhet Shabbat. There's a whole parak called Shmona Shiratzim. But we're going to learn about that later. But it's used just as the generic term for impurity because basically its rules, the rules of Tumat Shiratzim, are the standard rules. It doesn't have special rules. So, Titania, or Enli Ela or Be'emat Torah, we said that skin is subject to impurity, and we're talking about animal skin. So, all we know is Enli Ela or Be'emat Torah, all I know is that kosher animal skin can become Tameh. Or Be'emat Tameh Aminayin, how do I know that something made out of horsehide or some other non-kosher animal source is also subject to Tum'ah of any other source of Tum'ah? Talmud Lomar, the Torah comes to teach us, or, because it says or. It says the word o first. That, again, expands the category. It means additional, and it means that even a non-kosher animal can be subject, not the animal itself, but even the non-kosher animal's skin can be subject to Tum'ah. So we should say, just like over there, the non-kosher animal skin, like a horse hide or whatever, if it comes into contact with any kind of impurity, it will become impure. It will become tameh. So too, it should be able, if it's covering over you, if it's serving as a tent, it should be able to contract tumah from being a tent over human remains. So the Gemara says, no, but we can also raise an objection. That shiratzim, these animals, also have a stringency. These 8 shiratzim, these 8 crawling animals, have the stringency that these 8 rodents, that even a cha'adasha, a lentil size amount of their flesh, is a source of tumah. Now, in the case of dead bodies, what's the minimum size? A kazayit, the amount of an olive. Not the amount of a lentil. Lentil's tiny. You've seen a lentil. But, we're talking, a kazayit is bigger. So maybe the reason why, when it comes to shiratzim, when it comes to these crawling rodents, why their dead bodies can make a non-kosher animal skin tameh, because their dead bodies can make something tameh with such a tiny amount. Maybe we're very strict, but when it comes to tumat ohel, when it comes to a tent over a dead body, where dead body tum'ah, as stringent as it is, the measurement is the standard measurement. The amount of remains that has to be there is the standard amount. So maybe we wouldn't apply that stringency, and we would say that a non-kosher animal skin that's stretched over us as a tent will not become tameh. So now what Rava is going to do is like this. He's going to say, negaim yochichu, but let's go back to tzara'at. Remember, we had another case, tzara'at. And you said that the reason why tzara'at wasn't a valid case was because it has a stringency. And what was the stringency in tzara'at? That it applies even to strings, not just to woven fabric. Okay, the chazaradin, and then you'll say, okay, what about the case of shiratzim? Shiratzim don't have that stringency that they can make unwoven strings tameh. Oh, but they have the point that they have that their minimum measurement is so tiny. But lo rizeker rizev, lo rizeker rizeh. But we see that neither particular stringency is the explanation. In other words, the Gemara is trying to say this is a very common Talmudic logic. Lo re'izeker izeh, v'lo re'izeker izeh means that if I can show you that there's a stringent principle in 2 different cases, you might be able to show me that case A is already stringent for another reason. That's why it has that stringency. And then I'll show you case B, and you'll say, well, case B, the reason why it has that stringency is because it has another stringency as well. But if I can show you that there are 2 cases that both have this additional stringency, and even though each one has its respective stringencies, they're not the same, so those respective stringencies can't be the cause. In other words, the reason why in tzara'at we're saying that it applies to non-kosher animal skin can't be because tzara'at applies to unwoven threads, because the other situation where we find that non-kosher animal skins are included doesn't apply to unwoven threads. And we can't say that the reason why the tumah of shiratzim, of the rodents, why that applies to non-kosher animal skin is because the rodents transmit tumah with a small amount, because that can't be the reason why we apply it to non-kosher animal skin, because that wouldn't apply to tzara'at. In other words, tzara'at has a stringency, yes. You tried to blame the additional stringency of non-kosher animal skin on another stringency that it had, but I showed you a case where that stringency doesn't pertain, and you said, well, that's because it has a different stringency. So you're making excuses now. Because it's like you're making excuses, because every time you find a case where non-kosher animal skin is included, you're telling me, yeah, but there's another stringency in that situation too. Yeah, but you're going to say that every time now. In other words, you can't say, so obviously none of these particular stringencies you're pointing to are really the cause. Right? So therefore, ma tzad shaveh shebehen. So then we say, zeh tzad shaveh shebehen. So we must say that the reason why this stringency of non-kosher animal skin being included is found in two different places. Now, granted that the two different places have their own unique stringencies, but they don't share a stringency, is because she'or tameh behen, so that she'or tameh behen, ve'asa or be'emat tame'ah ke'or be'emat tehorah, that skin is subject to impurity in their cases, and we didn't make a distinction between kosher and non-kosher. Afani avi oil amet she'or tameh bo v'na'asa bo or be'emat tame'ah ke'or be'emat tehorah. So basically, very simply, we see that there are two cases where no distinction is made between kosher and non-kosher animal skins. Each one has its respective stringency, but neither respective stringency really explains why, because if it explained why, you wouldn't have two different cases with totally different unrelated stringencies, both leading to the same thing about the animal skin.
And the essence of the oil was skin.
Was skin.
It doesn't matter.
They're not making a
distinction. The oil was
distinction.
skin, and it doesn't matter whether it's kosher or non-kosher.
Right, that's what they're saying.
So, non-kosher.
The point is, just because if I can show you in two different cases that there's no difference between different types of skin, whether they're kosher or non-kosher, even though you can show me that in each of those cases there's another stringency that you might have thought is the reason why that stringency is being applied, I'm showing you it's not the same stringency. So why should it lead to the same results? Therefore, what do we say? Oh, the common denominator is that they both are holding that both cases have impure skins, and both cases are not making a distinction, and that's it.
It's interesting. It's interesting. This is one of the major flaws of most scientific studies today.
Mm-hmm.
They're missing this element.
Well, oftentimes in science, what they find is, for example, like if you look at classical physics versus the Einstein's chidushim. The big thing was that he noticed that we're making a lot of excuses for phenomena that are, this is an exception to the rule. Yeah, this is also an exception. Oh, there's another exception.
Right.
It's like this just doesn't make any sense anymore. We need to find what the underlying cause is, and then you realize that all these apparent exceptions to the rule are really manifestations of a more general rule that nobody realizes. Exactly. That's how scientific research often proceeds. You find a lot of different anomalies, and you're wondering why. Well, I can explain this anomaly locally by making an excuse for it, and I see another anomaly. I can explain it locally, but after a while they start cropping up, and you start wondering, this doesn't make any sense. There's a great book called The Evolution of Physics that Einstein wrote with another author, but it's an excellent book. It's a really, really good book where it reads like a detective novel, and he basically shows you how by discovering, by sort of identifying all these problems that everybody was brushing aside and giving pat solutions, that's how he sort of discovered he made his huge discovery. Because he said all of this just doesn't add up anymore. But that's basically what the Gemara is saying. Thinking scientifically, if you find an anomaly in two cases, true, you can try to attribute it to another anomaly in each case, but it's a stretch. I mean, the conclusion, the most logical conclusion is that there's no distinction between pure and impure skin. Now, Rav Mibarnish says, wait a second, I'm still not absolutely satisfied. Because if I can find a common denominator between those two cases that you used, other than just saying that it's a universal principle, if I can find one other common denominator, then I don't have to go this step that you're going. I don't have to apply it to the case of the ohel of the dead body. Because he says, look, because he said to Rav Ashi, so Amar le Rava Mibarnish le Rav Ashi, he said to Rav Ashi, Ikal Rifrach, I can still refute this. Mala tzara shaveh shebehen sheken tamein bepachot mikazayit. Tomar b'meit she'enot mitamei ela mikazayit. Wait a second, we have a problem. Because there's another thing that both tzara'at and the case of shiratzim have in common. They both transmit tum'ah less than a kazayit. So even though they don't both have the same stringency, they both are not standard in their measurement. In other words, the amount of tum'ah, the amount of tamei material in the case of a sheretz, we said, is only the amount of a lentil, of a rodent, right? It's only a lentil. And the amount of area that has to be covered by tzarat is the size of a bean, a gris. It's a bean. It's a small amount. It's smaller than a kazayit. So both of them have less than the standard. The standard measurement is kazayit. But tumat met, impurity of the dead, is only transmitted if you have remains of at least a kazayit, an olive's worth. Correct? So you see that you could say, I'll get out of the problem. I'll say that tzara'at and shiratzim, in both cases, they work even less than a kazayit, even less than an olive's worth, less than standard. And that's why, in those cases, we find that non-kosher and kosher animal skins are treated the same, because they both have a stringency. The stringency is that they're less than a kazayit, they're less than the standard measurement.
Since you put it that way, it sounds like the same stringency.
It's the same stringency, exactly. Right. And if I can find that the same stringency results in the same anomaly in two cases, then that makes sense. That's also scientific. If I have the same anomaly, two anomalies appearing in two different cases, and they're the same two, so then I'm justified in saying that they're connected. And therefore, the fact that in both cases there's less than a kazayit and transmitting tum'ah, and in both cases non-kosher and kosher animal skins are considered the same. It's not an anomaly anymore. That's the principle. That's what we discovered. But then the Gemara answers. Rav Ami Barnish says, even though I refuted your analogy, I'm still going to agree with you. I still agree with you. As we turn to Kafchet Amud Bet, second side of Kafchet, and by the way, this is very this is dissimilar to the way that discourse occurs today. Everybody's interested in the conclusion. They can't agree with you on a conclusion and disagree about your reasoning. If you disagree about reasoning, then things go haywire. You have to agree on the reasoning and on the conclusion nowadays. So he says, no, I disagree with your reasoning, but I come to the same conclusion. How so? Because I'm going to show you that we can prove it differently from a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is another form of logic where we reason from a lighter case to a more stringent case.
That's the
straightest way. It's the straightest path. Yeah. So how's he going to do it? As follows, because he says minot shalizim, from the hair of goats. She'en mitameh b'nega'im mitameh be'olamet, because even though notza shel izim, the hair of goats, is not one of the things that can have tzara'at on it. Tzara'at does not apply to the hair of goats. It's not one of the things that can have tzara'at. And yet, mitameh be'olamet, yet if you have a tent of goat hair over the remains of a dead body, it does become tameh. So we see that there's a stringency with regard to dead body transmission of tum'ah that doesn't exist in tzara'at. Because in tzara'at, if you had something that appeared like tzara'at on goat hair, it would not be tzara'at. But if you have the goat hair stretched as an ohel, stretched as a tent over you, it would become tameh. So therefore he says, or behemat tame'ah shemitamea b'nega'im enodin shemitamea be'olamet. So therefore the kal v'chomer actually stands. They don't even try to refute it. They accept it because they say that that just like notza shel izim, which was the first layer, by the way, in the Mishkan. We didn't mention the first layer of the Mishkan was from goat hair, and then you had the layer. You had the goat hair. You had the linen and wool, and you had and then you had the ram skins. Okay, so we see from there that definitely, when it comes to tumat met, when it comes to the impurity of the dead, goat hair is considered a valid ohel. It's considered a valid tent. And yet, in the case of tzara'at, it's not considered subject to the tumah of tzara'at. So what do you see? If when it comes to tzara'at, where goat hair is not subject to tumah, and yet we see non-kosher animal skin is, so certainly when it comes to tumat met, where goat hair is, then definitely non-kosher animal skin is going to be. And therefore, that's how he concludes. He says, I don't need the analogy from all the different cases. I'm going to conclude from there that non-kosher, there's no difference, there's no distinction between non-kosher animal skin, between horse hide, pig hide, whatever it is, and cow hide being used as a tent. They're both going to be subject to tumat met. So then we have to go back, because Rav Yosef made a statement before that the only things that were used for Masekhet Shamayim, the only things that were used for the Mishkan were kosher animals. Okay? And why did he bring that? He brought it in order to say that the tachash animal was a kosher animal. And since the Ortachash was a kosher animal, that would imply that maybe non-kosher animal skins. In other words, before we thought that, why did Rav Yosef say that? Why did Rav Yosef want to say that the Tachash was a kosher animal? What do we learn from that? What's the big deal? Oh, to show you that non-kosher animal skins are not included in the category of tent, of ohel. That's why he mentioned that, by the way, the Tachash was a kosher animal, because otherwise why would he have to mention that? But now that we see that that's not true, and that actually the even non-kosher animal skins that form a tent are considered a tent and will become tameh from the human remains inside. So then what halachic point is there in telling us that the tachash was a kosher animal? It's not halachically relevant. It's just a historical trivia. It doesn't mean anything. So why did he mention then that the only thing you can use for Masekhet Shabbat, for holy things or for divine service, is kosher animals? He couldn't have been talking about the Mishkan, because that would have just been a historical statement. It wouldn't have been a halachic statement, since it wouldn't teach us any halacha. And the halacha that we thought it taught us wasn't correct. So that can't be it. So therefore, what is he bringing that for? To teach you about for tefillin. The tefillin has to be from a kosher animal. That's what he meant when he said Masekhet Shamayim. When he said that anything that's made, any craft that's being done for God, so to speak, can only be done with kosher animal. He meant tefillin. He didn't mean the Mishkan. The Mishkan, it's true the Tachash was kosher, but it doesn't give us any halachic implication, so it's not important. What's important is tefillin.
And where does he take that differentiation?
From?
Where does he take the differentiation between tefillin and the for the tefillin you have to use the kosher animal, and for the Mishkan you don't have to?
He didn't say that. He still holds that for the Mishkan you do have to use kosher. He's just saying that since it has no halachic implication anymore.
It was something that he said someplace else, right?
All he said was that the only it's a general statement that the only thing that can be used for Masekhet Shamayim, for divine service, is the skin of a kosher animal. So we assume that he means that the roof of the Mishkan is made from a kosher animal,
right? Which
very well might be true.
Yeah.
But it doesn't teach us anything about halakha. Because even a non-kosher animal skin, as we showed, even a non-kosher animal skin can also be considered an ohel. So it's not relevant. In other words, it may be true,
so in our context,
but it's not relevant. It doesn't teach us any halakha anymore.
So he came to tell you that
right, so what?
To teach you
about tefillin. He must have been teaching you some halakha. He wasn't teaching you a history story.
And he wasn't saying it in the argument about...
Right. It was just being quoted in that argument. It was being quoted there. So now they're saying that must not have been the context, because why would he want to tell you the historical kashrut of the Mishkan? Since it doesn't have any halachic implications, and in fact the halachic implication we thought it had, to tell us that only kosher animal skins could be a tent, is not even true. So he's talking about tefillin. So tefillin v'hedya ketiv. What do you mean? That we already said, it says that the Torah of Hashem, that tefillin is...
Would he be teaching this to you?
It's a pasuk. It's a pasuk which says, that says that so that the Torah of Hashem will be in your mouth, which means to say that whatever the tefillin is made of has to be something that's allowed to be in your mouth.
Yeah.
That's a limud that we already know. Ela le'oran. He must be talking not about the parchments, but about the boxes. Okay? Va'amar Abaye, but Abaye says, Shin shel tefillin. In other words, we knew that the parchments had to be from a kosher animal, because that's where the real words of the Torah are. Maybe the boxes didn't need to be, and that's why he's telling you that the boxes do need to be. So the answer is no, because V'amar Abaye Shin shel tefillin halacha l'Moshe miSinai, because we said that it's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that it's a tradition going back to Moses at Sinai, that the Shin has to be written on the box of the tefillin. In other words, that means that even the box itself has the same kedusha as the parchment inside, and if the parchment inside has to be kosher, so does the leather that the box is made out of. Maybe you'll say that what he was referring to was that you have to wrap. You wrap the parchments inside the tefillin with a hair, and the hair of a cow, and you also it's woven. The weaving of the tefillin is done with gidin. It's done with sinews of an animal. It's not done with You look at the weaving that you see on the outside. That's
talking about the box.
Everything that's woven, that you see the stitches in the shell rosh and the shell yad, well, mainly you see on the rosh. Yeah, these are gidin. It's sinews of an animal. So
the thread.
Right? Yeah.
It's not fabric.
But that's hanami halacha l'Moshe miSinai. But this is also halacha l'Moshe miSinai. In other words, we knew this already, so we don't need Rav Yosef to tell us that you need to use a cow's hair to wrap the tefillin, or that you need to use the gidin, the sinews, to tie the tefillin, to weave the tefillin.
Except tefillin isn't one of the halacha that we do differently than in the time of Moshe?
Not necessarily. No, I don't think so. No. The Tanya, as it says in the Braita, tefillin merubaot Moshe Sinai, because we said that having square tefillin is a tradition going back to Moses. Nichrachot b'saran v'nitparot b'gidin, and similarly that it has to be wrapped in hair and it has to be sewn. That the tefillin is sewn with sinews. All of this is halacha Moshe Sinai. So we don't need Rav Yosef to tell us any of this. Ela there is tuot. So maybe you'll tell me that it's to tell you that the straps of the tefillin have to be from a kosher leather. A kosher animal. Rabbi Yitzchak says, that's also a tradition going back to Moshe Sinai. So it can't be. But what you told me, all that was learned from a halacha Moshe Sinai was that the ritzuot, that the straps have to be black. You didn't learn from a halacha Moshe Sinai that they have to be from a kosher animal. That's what Rav Yosef was coming to tell you. That even the straps of the tefillin have to be, in other words, even the arm strap has to be from a kosher animal, and that's what he meant to say. Mai have ala de tachash. Okay, so we want to know Shaya b'mei Moshe. We want to know what is the deal with the tachash that existed in the times of Moshe. So even though it might not have any halachic implication, what's the deal? Is it kosher or not? So Amar Rabbi Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So Rabbi Ilah said that Rishon ben Lakish said, Omer haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir used to say, Tachash haya b'mei Moshe, b'ri'ah b'fnei atzma. Haya. V'lo hechriu ba chachamim, im min chayahu, im min behemahu. The Tachash that existed in the time of Moshe was some kind of unique creation that was a b'ri'ah b'fnei atzma. It was a separate creation, meaning it didn't easily fall into any category. No, they're going to talk about that in a second, though. Oh. So there's that it's neither they didn't know whether to categorize it as behema, domesticated animal, or chaya, wild animal. Now that would have halachic implications, actually, because there are certain things that relate to a chaya that don't relate to a behema. For example, if you slaughter a behema and a cow, you don't have to cover the blood. And you're not allowed to eat the chelev. You're not allowed to eat certain fats. You have to do nikur to remove the fats. A chaya, you have to cover the blood. Like a deer, let's say, if you slaughter it, you have to cover the blood, but you're allowed to eat the fats of the deer because the deer could never be a korban, so its fats are not prohibited for consumption. So it makes a halachic difference, although we never see it. And it had a horn, one single horn on its head. That's why it sounds like a unicorn to you. And at that time it appeared to Moshe, meaning he was able to find it in the desert during that time, but we never saw it again. And then the Mishkan was made from it and it was hidden, meaning nobody ever saw it again. So this animal was a species that appeared and disappeared. Isn't it true that the fact that it had one horn on its head means that it was tahor? It must have been a tahor animal, a kosher animal. Because it says that the ox that Adam offered to God as a korban had one horn on its head. Shene'emar v'atitav l'Hashem mishor par makrin mafris. This is a pasuk from Tehillim that it should be better for that it should be for Hashem better than a shor par, than as the Mefarshim explained that shor par means a very large ox, meaning a very fine ox. Makrin mafris, that has horns and has split hooves. So makrin mashma. Makrin sounds like it has two horns because it means makrin is actually the verb, like it's a horning animal, like it's an animal that has horns. Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak mikeren ketiv. It's written without. If you look at the pasuk, it's written makrin without a yud. So instead of it being plural, it looks like it says mikeren, like it's written with a singular, meaning that it had only one horn.
Where? In the Torah.
In Tehillim, it looks like it's read mikeren, doesn't have yud. V'livshot minei min behemahu. Why can't we determine then that it's a type of animal? In other words, if we're saying that the tachash here was really the type of animal that Adam HaRishon brought, why can't we conclude that just like Adam HaRishon brought this one horned animal, and it was a min behema. It was considered in the category of behema, not chaya, domesticated, not wild animal. So we should say the same thing about the tachash if it had only one horn. So the answer is no, because kevan diika keresh de min chayahu. Since we have the case of the keresh, which again is a question what exactly animal this is, but it's some kind of an animal that has a single horn and is considered a chaya, not a behema. It's considered a wild animal and not a domesticated animal, and it has only one horn. Therefore, having only one horn is not a definitive sign of either being a behema or a chaya, of either being a wild animal or a domesticated animal. Now here, the keresh is what some say is referring to the unicorn.
They are not domesticated animals with carnage.
Well, what's it called? A shore, an ox is considered domesticated. A ram is domesticated. A ram is behema, where we get a shofar. It has horns. Yeah, they do. They could.
Bull.
Yeah, a bull maybe is a little bit more wild, but yeah, it could be. So, but whatever we see here is that we concluded that that it's definitely tahor, and it's definitely, but we're not sure if it's a behema or a chayam. Now the Mishnah says, we're going to just go a little bit further, so we get down to the bottom of the Amud. This is what we read every Shabbat, so it should sound familiar. If you have Petilat Beged, you made a wick out of a piece of cloth, and you folded it into a wick, but you didn't singe the top of the wick, so it's folded, but nothing has sealed it, basically, to be like that. You've just folded it into the shape of a wick. Rabbi Eliezer omer tamei yived madikin ba. Rabbi Akiva omer toreo madikin ba. So Rabbi Eliezer says it's tamei, and you can't use it for the light of Shabbat. And Rabbi Akiva says that it is tahor, meaning it's not subject to tumah, and you can use it. Now we're going to see why these two things are connected. So we read this every Shabbat, and now you're always wondering what are they talking about. Now we're going to see. The Gemara says, what they're talking about here is like this. That they're talking about somebody who took a garment which was the minimum size of 3 etzba'ot by 3 etzba'ot. Okay, so it's 3 fingers by 3 fingers in size. And so therefore it would normally be subject to tum'ah. But you rolled it into a small piece. You rolled it into a very small piece. Into a wick. So now it doesn't have the dimensions anymore. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, it doesn't matter. Sure it does. So all you did was fold it, but really it still has the dimensions inside there. Since you didn't singe it, you didn't make it into a new entity. You just folded it into a different size, into a different shape. So it's still going to be subject to tum'ah, and we'll see why you can't light with it in a second. And Rabbi Akiva is going to say that no, since you folded it into the small shape, even though you didn't singe it, since it no longer has the dimensions actually right now, it's going to be tahor. And Beha, Pelige, this is what they're arguing about. The Rabbi Eliezer Savar Kipul Eno Mo'il, Uvmil Teka Maita Kaima, that Rabbi Eliezer says that when you roll something or fold it, it doesn't change the nature of the thing. Okay? And Rabbi Akiva Savar Kipul Mo'il, Ubatule Batil. And Rabbi Akiva says that because you folded it into a shape that now it no longer has those minimum dimensions, even though you didn't seal it that way, for all intents and purposes, it's less than the required dimensions, and it can't be tamei anymore. But what's the basis of their argument regarding lighting? What's the difference whether this is a tamei or tahor thing if when it comes to lighting Shabbat candles? So, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Oshaya, v'chein Amar Rav Adabar Ahava. Here's the first explanation, and then tomorrow we're going to learn the second one on the next Amud. That Rabbi Elazar says that Rabbi Oshaya says, and this is what Rav Adabar Ahava says. We're talking about a case where this garment was exactly 3 by 3. Exactly 3 by 3 etzba'ot. And Ubi Yom Tov Shechal Yod Ve'erev Shabbat Askinan, and we're talking about a Friday which was also a Yom Tov. So Friday is Shavuot or something like that. And you're going to light the Shabbat candles. And everybody is agreeing on the following 2 premises. First of all, that you can use, for lighting, you can use kelim, you can use vessels, but you can't use broken vessels because they're muktzeh. And everybody is agreeing with the principle of ula, that somebody who lights a candle has to light most of the protrusion of the wick. In other words, you can't just put the lighting like this and walk away. You have to hold the fire to the wick until it fully catches. Now, what is the point here? Let me just put it into perspective for a second. Okay, so what are the premises in operation here? If you have this 3 by 3 etzba'ot, 3 by 3 finger breadth cloth, Okay. Now, and you remember, it's Yom Tov. That's also Shabbat. That's Erev Shabbat. So it's Yom Tov. And if this cloth becomes less than 3 by 3 etzbaot, it's considered like a broken vessel, because it no longer has the dimensions of a functional patch anymore. A functional patch is a minimum of 3 by 3 etzbaot. So the minute it gets lower than 3 by 3 etzbaot, it's no longer functional. It's a broken vessel. Now you might say, well, who cares if it's a broken vessel? I'm going to light it and walk away. So by the time that it burns that first little bit away of the wick, I won't be touching it anymore. So who cares if it's muktzeh? Answer, no, because you have to hold the fire to the wick until the majority of the protruding part of the wick is lit. So the point is, you're going to have contact with this, and you're going to be breaking it. Effectively, you're going to be breaking it, because right now it's 3 etzbaot by 3 etzbaot. And by your holding on to it, it's going to be breaking, so to speak, in your hands while you're still having contact with it, and you're going to be touching a muktzeh thing on Shabbat, on Yom Tov. Okay. So what's the point? So Rabbi Eliezer says that Kipul eno mo'il v'kevad dedlik beporta havyale shever kli v'kikabadlik b'shever kli kamadlik. So what's the problem according to Rabbi Eliezer? The fact that you folded this into a small piece doesn't make it any different. It's still a functional entity of 3 by 3 etzbaot, 3 by 3 finger breadths. And therefore what's going to happen here is, when you take the fire and you're touching that wick, and you're going to have to keep touching it until the wick is fully caught, what you're doing is you just broke that vessel on Yom Tov, and now you're touching it. And you're touching muktzeh. That's no good. And Rabbi Akiva is going to say, Rabbi Akiva says, "Kipul mo'il ve'entot kli alav v'chimadlik kamadlik ve'etzba'alma kamadlik." No, he says, you know what? You rolled this wick before Yom Tov. You rolled it before Yom Tov. So you're not breaking a vessel on Yom Tov by lighting this wick. You already rolled it. The rolling that you did before transformed it into a different entity already, even before Yom Tov. And therefore, when you're handling it on Yom Tov, even if it's diminishing in its size, even if you have to hold the flame to that wick for an extended period of time, it doesn't matter, because you're touching something that was already changed into a new form before Yom Tov. It's not breaking now while you're lighting it. You broke it already, so to speak, before Yom Tov when you made it into a wick. And Amar Rav Yosef says, Hainu ditanena, this is what we learned, Gimel al Gimel mitzum tzamot velo yadana lemay hilcheta, that all this time I had no idea what the teaching was that they kept telling me, that we're talking about exactly 3 by 3 finger breadths. I never understood what they would repeat this teaching, but without context. He says, now I know what they were talking about. They were talking about this case. That this is the case of the discussion where so I didn't know what it was referring to. Now I understand that the reason why we were talking about why it was being emphasized 3 by 3 finger breadths was because 3 by 3 finger breadths is the exact size that if you diminish it even a tiny bit, it's going to be considered a broken vessel according to Rabbi Eliezer as soon as you diminish it, and it's going to be a problem to handle it on Yom Tov. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, since it's been broken before, it's not going to be a problem to use on Yom Tov. And then he says, and from the very fact that Rav Ada bar Ahava is interpreting the machloket here according to Rabbi Yehuda, who is stringent about muktzeh on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and who says that a wick that becomes broken or an item that becomes broken cannot be handled on Yom Tov anymore, I can conclude that he must hold like Rabbi Yehuda. And Umi Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava Hachi, is it really true that Rav Ada bar Ahava holds like Rabbi Yehuda? Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, as we go to Chavtet Amud Aleph, we're just going to finish up the piece here. Nochri shechakak kav b'bikat Yisrael b'zika b'yom tov. That he said, that Rav Ada bar Ahava had said in another context, that if a non-Jew cuts a hole into a piece of wood, shaping it into a new vessel on Yom Tov, even though that's considered, so to speak, breaking it. You're changing it into something new. You're changing it into something new on Yom Tov. And nonetheless, Rav Ada bar Ahava said you can now take that piece of wood and still use it as firewood on Yom Tov, even though you're handling something that's new. Va'amai noladhu, but isn't it nolad? Isn't it true that it's a new entity, and a new entity can't be handled on Yom Tov because of the laws of Muktzeh? Answer, that basically, according to Rav Ada bar Ahava personally, he is lenient about Muktzeh and would say that even a new entity on Yom Tov, you'd be able to handle it, you'd be able to use it. even a broken vessel, even if this wick is in fact becoming broken by lighting it on Yom Tov, you would be able to do it anyway because it doesn't matter. He's lenient about this muktzeh. However, he was explaining the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, the premise of their machloket was that they were following the stringent view of muktzeh. That's why he had to mention it. He personally doesn't subscribe to it, but it was the solution of what the basis is of the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. Have a great day.